Good evening. Welcome to MUFON Los Angeles. My name is Steve Murillo. I'm the State Section Director of MUFON LA. We have a very interesting guest for you tonight. The choice, Mars, Planet X, and the physics of 2012. There's a great shift coming in the near future. We can all feel it. What will happen in 2012? Will there be physical changes, spiritual awakenings? What do governments know about this? And how are they preparing? How do ancient ruins on Mars provide us with the key to understanding these events? How does the search for mythical Planet X fit into this equation? And what could each of us do to influence this coming shift in both consciousness and reality? Researcher Mike Bara is here tonight, and he's going to explore the physics and the metaphysics of 2012 in this lecture. Mike Bara is an aerospace engineer consultant with more than 25 years of experience working on projects like the Boeing 757, the 767, the 787 Dreamliner, the Bombardier Aerospace Global Express, and the F-35 jet fighter. Bara is also an author, screenwriter, and lecturer. His first book, Dark Mission, The Secret History of NASA, which he co-wrote with Richard Hoagland, was a New York Times bestseller in 2007. That was a great book. Bara began writing after completing his career as a card-carrying member of the military-industrial complex. Mike has made numerous public appearances, lecturing on the subjects of space science, NASA, physics, and the link between science and spirit. He has been a featured guest on Coast to Coast, radio show with George Norrie. Mike has also had a number of other irons in the fire. He has a second book coming. It's called The Choice, and it has a unified field of theory of physics and metaphysics that peels back the layers of mystery surrounding 2012 and the Mayan calendar. Asgard Media is currently making a documentary based on his book. His other book, Lightbringer, is a novel, and it's a Da Vinci Code-style thriller based around the murder and intrigue inside NASA. Would you all please join me in welcoming Mike Bara for this great lecture.
Silence. Thank you very much for having me here. You know, MUFON is an organization that I think everybody who's into anything that's slightly paranormal or metaphysical or different has heard of. You guys were the start of many things. I mean, I don't know how long you've been in this location, but I'm sure in MUFON LA, a lot of people, very famous people have spoken for you guys, probably Stanton Friedman and Hoagie. Was Hoagie ever here sometime? Probably. So I think it's really important to recognize that you guys were pioneers in starting people to think outside the box and think about what reality really was, because it's actually quite a bit different than what we see on TV every night. It's certainly a lot different than what we read in the newspapers, if we still read newspapers anymore, what we read on the internet, what Drudge gives us. So I don't know how many of you here are experiencers. I don't know how many of you have actually seen a UFO. I'll tell you flat out, I never have. I've wanted to. I never have. I think some people are able to see them. I think some people are more sensitive to what's out there. They're aware when they're around. Some people, like me, probably just aren't meant to see them. I mean, I'm 50 years old and I haven't seen one. I don't think I'm going to anytime soon. I thought I saw one a couple years ago in Redondo Beach where I live, and it turned out to be a little helicopter some guy was flying around at night. So I've gotten all excited a couple times, but I've never seen one. But it's important to understand that what I'm going to talk about tonight, and extraterrestrials and visitors and even probably abductions and all the things that go with that are all connected. This is all part of some bigger picture that's playing out, and what I feel like is at least a small portion of it. I'm beginning to understand how things are going to go down here in the next couple years. So that's what the next book, which is going to be called The Choice, by the way, get that on camera there, that's the cover. Little blatant self-promotion, never above that. Is going to be about. It's going to come out in October from New Page Books, and what I'd like to do tonight is kind of give you a preview of the stuff that's going to be in there. So I guess we'll just get going, and let me see if this works. There we go. Okay, so where this actually starts is with 2012 in the Mayan calendar. I mean, I'm sure everybody's heard of this. There are different tenuous connections between extraterrestrial visitations and 2012 and the end of this long count calendar cycle. And the thing that's interesting about the Mayan calendar and other forms of timekeeping that are different than how we view time today is that today we view time as a line. It's linear. It's an arrow. Basically the nickname or the word for it is time's arrow. In the past, they thought of time as a circle, and they considered it to be cyclical. And what I've found is that I believe that time, in fact, is cyclical. It's not linear, and the Mayans somehow knew this. This is the calendar itself. Let me see if that's the laser. This is sort of an example of how these different sort of gears and this whole clockwork of the Mayan calendar work. And what you have is you have days and weeks and months and years, and you have much, much longer cycles. And the long count cycle that ends on December 21st, 2012, the winter solstice, is a 5,125 year cycle. So that is the ultimate long count, and that's what we're counting down to. Now, whoops, went the wrong way. Other cultures have looked at time in the same way. The Indians, the Hindus, back in really before Christ, also viewed time as a circle, but they viewed it as something that we pass through different ages of consciousness, different ages of spiritual development. It started with the Golden Age. We descend into the Silver Age, the Bronze Age, the Iron Age, back to the Bronze Age, the Silver, and the Golden Age again. And they viewed this as a constant cycle. And the question is, it's always been out there, is it linked to precession, this 26,000 year cycle? Or there are some people that say that these Yuga cycles last millions and millions and millions of years, more like 26 million years. So right now, most people consider us to be about 2,000 in a Bronze Age and ascending. I'm not really sure that's correct. As we get into this, I'll talk about some of the ways that you can recognize where we're at in this cycle. So the point is that there are cycles of time, and the question is, does something happen at the end of these cycles? Now, if you buy the traditional interpretation of the Yuga cycles, we're kind of in the beginning of the Bronze Age, and nothing special at all should be happening in our world. I mean, we're just sort of getting better, getting healthier, life's improving for all of us. But that's not the way everybody views it. The 2012 scenario is frequently portrayed as catastrophic, cataclysmic. Something bad will happen, like a gigantic solar flare will consume the Earth. Or in the film 2012, you had all these great visions, great spectacular special effects of famous world landmarks collapsing. Everybody see that movie? Anybody not really see it? You like it? I don't know. I thought it was pretty good for a disaster movie. They had different aspects of it. The floods of the oceans coming up over the continents. Oh, I'm sorry, I don't know how this got in there. This is actually a webcam picture of Compton, live camera. Trying to be funny. I'm not as funny as some people, but yeah. Anyway, there's Vegas. It just makes me cry. There's Steve Wynn on the top of the hotel there, desperately trying to escape. And actually, that is Hermosa Beach right there. I would live in Redondo Beach, just down there. It looks like I'm okay, but I think Sean David Morton is sinking into the water there, which, hope Sean's not here, which he is. Anyway, so where this, I kind of evolved. I started out interested in UFOs. I developed, after that, a fascination with what Richard Hoagland was doing with extraterrestrial artifacts, because I felt like, okay, we can prove this, right? If we can get good pictures, we can prove it. Of course, they never really gave us the good pictures, and I still, honestly, if you go through Dark Mission, Richard and I have kind of a fundamental disagreement. I don't believe we've ever gotten really good pictures of the face on Mars or some of the other objects there. I think that they're mostly real, mostly good, but I think there's areas on them that have been modified. So that story is all in Dark Mission, The Secret History of NASA. There's a new revised edition that came out last year in October. Revised and expanded like it needed to be any longer. It's like, I don't know, what is it now, 600 pages or something like that. It almost killed me in 2007. I will not ever write anything that big again. But, Richard and me, we can both talk, and that's kind of how it evolved. We just started putting everything into it. So in Chapter 2 of that, we talk about physics. We talk about what Richard has dubbed hyperdimensional physics, and we're going to talk a bit more about that tonight because it does connect to all this stuff and all these changes that are happening. My next book is going to be called The Choice. This is the preliminary cover. It is not going to be called The Physics of the Apocalypse. I had a big argument with my publisher about that. I want to talk about the physics of the next phase of our development as a species. And I think that the extraterrestrials that are here are interested in what's going to happen here. And what they're waiting for, what they're watching, is what choice we're going to make. And tonight I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what I think that choice is going to have to be. So I expect that UFO sightings will dramatically increase in the next couple of years as we build up to this. And again, it may not be exactly December 21st, 2012, but we're definitely going to enter into a phase where things are going to start to change. Things are going to start to get different. Things are probably going to start to get weird. And that might mean things like, you know, aliens appearing in Times Square and kind of walking around and then just disappearing. Just very, very strange things are going to start to happen. I have some friends that are, how can I say this without sounding kooky, psychic mediums. And I actually do believe that many of them do have these abilities. And they tell me, and I believe them, that they have never seen so many ghosts on the earth as there are right now. That their whole lifetimes, they see them once in a while, and now they're just, the place is swamped with spirits. So I think it's as if everybody is interested in what's going on here on the earth and what's going to happen. Okay, so how this connects is that the basic premise of hyperdimensional physics is that everything is interconnected. All of the stars, all of the planets, the planet itself, all of us, we're all interconnected, and that's not a new idea, but as we get into it, hopefully I can prove to you that there actually is some experimental evidence that shows that this is the case. So what you have is every planet in this solar system, and remember that when we say solar system, we don't take it very seriously. This is a system. All the planets are connected and they're dependent on each other, and they're all generating waves of energy. Now, they're generating those in higher dimensions. They're generating those, you know, through the ether, as they used to call it back in the 1800s. It's not something we can necessarily see or measure, but we can measure the effects of that energy as it comes back out into our three-dimensional realm. Okay, so this is the best explanation for hyperdimensional physics I've ever actually seen. The ant is sitting there on the anthill. He says, "Say, now I'm starting to feel kind of warm." You know, from his perspective, he can't see the kid. He can't see the kid there with the magnifying glass. He sure as heck can't see the sun, but he can feel the energy. And he could even, if he left his anthole and walked around, he'd even be able to measure around the periphery of where that magnifying glass was creating more heat. And that's the example of how this works. You get energy from these higher dimensions, and you can measure that energy, but you really don't know where it's coming from, and you really can't see these higher spatial dimensions. So the key to doing that, the key to getting that energy, is through rotation. You know, you've heard the old thing with, you know, real estate. The secret of real estate is location, location, location. And Richard says the key to hyperdimensional physics is rotation, rotation, and rotation. Because the fact is that everything rotates. Everything in this universe is rotating. All the atoms in your body have electrons rotating about them. All of you, we are rotating right now. This planet is rotating. When you're at rest, when you're sleeping, everything in you is rotating. And I believe firmly that that's the only way everything actually comes alive, is through this motion, this constant motion that the universe is in. Now, when I talk about higher dimensions, the point is, if you use the visual spectrum as an example, we can see about that much of the different kinds of light that are out there. In the electromagnetic wavelengths, you've got, you know, we're seeing a very, very tiny portion of it. If something exists in X-rays and Y-rays, we can't see it except with special devices that see things differently than we do. It's the same thing with this concept of higher dimensions and other beings, like maybe even little guys with big black eyes, that seem to move back and forth between their reality and our reality with some ease. Okay, the other thing that I want to talk about is that everything is putting out energy. And the question is, does this stuff have a measurable effect, and does this stuff come out in sort of a spherical manner, or is it directional? And what I'm going to show you later is that it is, in fact, directional. So the key to all this, and how this energy is generated from these rotating bodies, is something that Einstein called torsion, or what's actually, I think, a misnomer is a torsion field. Now, what happened is that you know, all the current models of physics are basically completely messed up. It started out with Newton, and Newton's laws of motion work great as long as you don't spin anything. And as I just pointed out, everything is spinning, everything is rotating. Beyond that, you have Einstein and relativity. And relativity works great on the big scale, but on the smaller scale, it completely falls apart. So they again had to come in with quantum mechanics and quantum physics. And that works great as long as you don't include gravity. So basically, there is no theory of physics that can explain everything, and they do not agree with each other on many aspects of it. But the hyperdimensional model basically says that everything happens through this energy that's ported into our universe through these higher dimensions. And the methodology, the signature of that, is this twisting, spinning field. Now, where this came from is that Einstein, there is a law, Newton's law, that says if something's in motion, unless some force acts upon it, it's going to stay in that same motion, right? Unless gravity pulls on it, magnetism, some sort of plasma interacts with it, it's going to just keep going. It's not going to do anything else. It's going to move in a straight line. The problem is that as they did experiments, everything moved. Even when there was no measurable magnetic field, no magnetic pulls on it, no gravity, no nothing. So that really was a problem. So Einstein said, I got it, space is curved. Okay, now that's ridiculous, all right? Space is not curved, but eventually out of that, what he got was that space does twist, or it can be twisted. Space-time can be twisted. So, you know, when I hear these whenever I hear the word quantum in anything, you know, quantum time, you know, quantum, I don't know. Whenever I hear that word, it's like, to me, that means the guy doesn't know what he's talking about, but he's throwing this word out there because it sounds really cool, like he really knows what he's talking about. You know, when you have these broken theories of physics, what you end up with is you end up talking about stuff like dark matter, okay? Now, dark matter is ridiculous. Here's what happened. They basically went through and they looked at the universe, and they said, well, okay, so matter, creates gravity. So you have to have this amount of gravity to hold everything together. The problem is when they looked around the universe, what they found was that 70% of the matter that had to be there to create the gravity was missing. So they said, oh, I've got it. It's not that there's some other higher force tugging and pulling and holding things together that we can't see. It's that all this matter is actually invisible. Okay, so that's silly. Here's another example of torsion. This is actually a specific emission from the sun coming out at about 19.5 degrees. If you read Dark Mission, you'll know what that's all about. And it's spinning and twisting exactly like this motion that Einstein talked about. If you go to Wikipedia, they'll tell you, oh, you know, torsion is a pseudoscience, it's a scam, and all these Russian experiments were called a scam by the Russians. Well, by the KGB, yeah, but not by everybody else. So again, everything's in motion, the galaxy's in motion, all of us are moving right now. And actually, we are on a path, an elliptical path, around the center of the galaxy, and we are right out there in the Orion Arm from the center of the Milky Way. Now, in this higher dimensional physics, what's implied by this is that as our position changes as the Earth's position changes relative to the planets, then the physics should theoretically change. And as the sun's position changes relative to the center of the galaxy, then the sun's physics and the solar system's physics should also change. So here's our path. We are about 26,000 light years from the center of the galaxy. We are on an elliptical path. It takes us it's debatable, but it takes somewhere between 250 and 260 million years for the Earth to complete one complete traverse of the center of the galaxy. Now, as the solar system moves, it also adheres to this torsion motion. If you were to look at this from edge on, from the side, the sun, the solar system, would appear to go up and down in a wave motion, but it's also twisting around this orbital path, and again, following this twisting, spinning, torsion motion. Now, I didn't know that until very recently, and you know, again, everything seems to apply to this torsion model that Wikipedia says is a pseudoscience. Now, how this all connects is through precession. Another example of something weird, something going on that's not explainable. Precession is where the spin axis of the Earth, you know, it rotates, it slightly wobbles on its axis, and as it does, it creates this long, great circle which takes about 25,920 years to complete one total circle of this precessional. They call it the Great Astronomical Year. It takes about 72 years for the axis to move 1 degree along this 360-degree arc. Now, the common explanation for precession is that the moon is torquing on the Earth. It's pulling it with its gravity, and it's causing the Earth to spin and wobble and precess. The problems with that are that the moon also precesses, but a lot less than the Earth, and if it's all about gravity, how come the moon doesn't precess way more than the Earth? Because the Earth has a lot more gravity, and obviously we're equal distance, on the same distance from each other. The other problem is that the moon's been moving away from the Earth at a rate of about 1.5 inches a year. We measured that from the Apollo laser reflectors that were left on the moon during the 1960s. And at that rate, as the moon goes farther away, what should be happening is that precession should be slowing down, because if it's the tug of the moon that's causing it, it should be getting less as the moon moves away. In fact, precession is accelerating. It's getting faster as the moon moves farther away. So there's got to be some other unseen hidden force tugging on the Earth and tugging on the spin axis. Okay, so again, this is another example of how this works. Basically, a droplet of water hits a pond. The pond creates these waves, and this is a two-dimensional example. But as these waves and other droplets hit, you begin to have interactions. And these interactions are exactly like what you would have in the solar system. Here's a few planets sending out their energy, and as they begin to cross each other, they begin to interact or interfere, and this is going to cause ripples and changes in space and time, and theoretically should affect us here on the Earth. Now, again, here's an example of how all the different planets are affecting us. Now, it's interesting because as you go through and look at some of these things, these studies I'm going to talk about later, what you have is that you find that Jupiter and Saturn have a tremendous effect on the Earth and on different things like radio signals. And the reason for that is that because they contain the most angular momentum in the solar system. Even though the sun has the most mass, the planets have the most momentum, and that means basically spin energy. So the more they spin, the more energy and the more effect they seem to have in this model. Okay, so how this all played out was that in the 1950s in RCA, they said, look, we are having some problems with our shortwave radio transmission, so guess what? We want to figure out why. Why don't you go see if there's a pattern to it? So they hired this guy, John Nelson, and he went through and he found that there was a pattern. And the pattern was that whenever the planets, especially the Jovian planets, in other words, Jupiter, Saturn, Neptune, and Uranus, were in certain positions, that the radio signals got either better or worse. When they were in opposition, 180 degrees apart, with the Earth in the middle, using the Earth as the center, the signals were pretty bad. When they were in a triangle formation, 2 or 3 planets like this, signals got much better. The weird thing is it's all sort of coordinated with, it all fit with astrology. Astrology says that when you have trines and you have these different 120-degree relationships, that, I forget what they call that one, sextile, I think. Well, a trine is the 3 planets, but a sextile is like a 120-degree relationship as opposed to a 60-degree relationship. At any rate, those are positive, and then the radio signals would get better. When you were squared 90 degrees on these arcs, or when you were in opposition, things got worse. And he found correlated very, very accurately that this was the case. So this is an example of a trine, okay? That would be 3 planets sort of in a trine. The Earth would be in the center of that, and then as this kind of condition took place, Nelson found, the signals got an awful lot better. Now remember, all these signals are electromagnetic waves, okay? That's what shortwave radio is. It's an electromagnetic energy. Here's an example of a square. When 2 planets were square to each other, especially the big planets, which had the most spin energy, things got worse. Now what was happening was that the sun would get super excited during these negative things. It would spew out a lot more electromagnetic energy, and that would affect the ionosphere of the Earth, and the signals would get crappy. Here's an opposition, planets across from each other. Okay, so it's this kind of thing, this geometry of the solar system seems to affect radio signals on Earth. Now that is impossible. If you believe in Einstein, if you believe in Newton, if you believe in quantum mechanics, any of this stuff, that's not possible because you cannot have this kind of effect from the planets because they're not sending out any gravity or magnetism or anything that they accept as an energy field or an energy force in conventional physics. Now later on, recently in Australia, there's some more studies done, and it found that the bottom line was that the Jovian planets, govern the sun's solar cycle. So this reinforced what Nelson had already found in the 1950s. And the interesting thing about it is they said, however, we are unable to suggest a plausible underlying physical cause for the coupling. What they said was not only was the sunspot cycle caused by this, but the sun itself was affected by the positions of Jupiter and Saturn. Now that is pretty revolutionary, even though it might be kind of boring to you. What it means is that astrology is actually real, because what all of your thoughts are, all of your beliefs, all of the things that are going on in your head is electromagnetic energy, electromagnetic waves. So if electromagnetic energy is affected by the positions of the planets in terms of shortwave radio signals, there's absolutely no reason why your thoughts, your brain waves, aren't going to be affected by these same changes in the geometry of the solar system. And what that could do is, I'm going to move through these a little bit. What that theoretically means is that your consciousness itself can be affected by the positions of the planets. So again, it's not revolutionary, it's called astrology, but it's actually turns out to be real. Now, there are other effects that have taken place over the years that can't be explained. There was a guy named Jacques Allais in the 1950s, who's actually a Nobel Prize-winning economist who got interested in physics, and he started doing some experiments with paraconical pendulums, pendulums that are free swinging. And he decided to set these up during a couple of eclipses that took place over Paris. And when he did, what happens with these pendulums is that they will basically follow the rotation of the Earth. As the Earth spins counterclockwise, they will, over time, if you have a camera that will correct for the spin of the Earth, you'll see that they actually rotate with the spin of the Earth. Now, what happened was during the eclipse, these things started to not rotate with the spin of the Earth, but actually go backwards and accelerate dramatically. And when the eclipse ended 4 or 5 minutes later, they went back to their normal slow forward rotation. Now, again, that's absolutely impossible. Basically, he wrote some papers in the 50s. Werner von Braun got really interested in this after he had some problems with Explorer, which went, I don't know, a third higher and farther and faster than it was supposed to when he launched it. And it had some spinning elements on it. So NASA decided after years and years in 1999 to repeat these experiments during some eclipses that took place. And they conducted, during an eclipse that took place in 1999, they conducted a bunch of experiments at a bunch of different locations as the eclipse passed over. All the data was sent to a specific researcher. I forget his name. I don't think it's on there. It's David something. And this guy took all the data and disappeared. And nobody's seen him or the data since. So why? Just because it violates the so-called laws of physics? Now, again, how this applies is in other examples of things that happened. Like other types of eclipses. Now, there's a transit. The Venus transit is something that happens where basically Venus passes between the Earth and the Sun. Now, Venus is not big enough to blot the Sun out like the Moon is, but it does basically create a little mini eclipse. So in 2004, Richard got the idea that he would take a look and do some measurements of things that were going on during the Venus transit. Now, he didn't have a paraconical pendulum, but he did have an idea. I was going to talk about, you see these different little spots here, Venus. I'm trying to find the laser on here. I don't want to screw something up. That's not it. There we go. That's somebody else's laser. Nice try. Okay. So interestingly, for some reason in astronomy, when transits like this are tracked, they have these different conditions where they're touching at the outside edge and in the middle of the axis and at the end. These are called contacts, and these are the most important things that they measure at a Venus transit. And really, in conventional physics, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But we will talk about it as we go through. So this is an actual photograph of Venus during the 2004 Venus transit. And Venus transits take place pretty rarely. They take place over the course of about, I think, 123 years. You have then 2 within 12 years, or 2 within 8 years. And then I think you have a cycle of 243 years where you don't have one. And then again, you have 2 within 8 years. So it was a really unique opportunity, one of the first ones in modern times to actually photograph Venus as it transited the sun. It's a beautiful picture. There's the inside contact position as it started to cross, and it's a close-up, and they're just incredible. So what Richard did is he set up this experiment, at Coral Castle in Florida. Now, he picked that because it's limestone. It's built out of the same stuff the pyramids are built out of. And he used a little device, which I don't think I have any details on. Basically, it was a little tuning fork that he took out of an old Accutron watch. And these things vibrate back and forth, just the way you guys vibrate, and because they're partially spinning and rotating. So he figured if there was any sort of ripple effect going on in the physics, that this sensitive little tuning fork would be affected by it. Well, sure enough, it was. When you had contact conditions at the edges and when the center of Venus crossed the center of the sun, you got these big spikes in the vibration frequency of the tuning forks. I think he was on this Fox special a couple months ago, about 6 months ago, talking about this, but it kind of ended up silly. So this is an example of, and the really interesting thing is that as Venus passed the sun, as it left the sun, in essence, what happened is that the signals got stronger and stronger, and they actually were the most intense after these contact conditions ended and Venus was leaving the region of the sun. So what happened was it seems to have pulled the energy more intensely as it was actually leaving the transit, passing in front of the sun forever, well, for a while. So how this relates to 2012, finally he gets to it, is that I think most of us know, on December 21st, 2012, around December, we're going to have this alignment, similar to the alignment of Venus and the sun, with the solar system, the sun itself, with the galactic center, the galactic equator. Now, it's not exactly lined up with the center where we think the center of the galaxy is, or the black hole, which is in Sagittarius A, but it's lined up pretty well, and there's a lot of people that think that that might have some effect. Well, there's an example. Sagittarius A is where they think this supermassive black hole is at the center of the galaxy. And it's a big thing, and it's spinning around. It's massive. I think it takes 11 minutes to spin, and it is, I forget the size of it, but it's big, and it's pumping out a lot of energy. Here's an example of a photograph of Sagittarius A, an X-ray photograph from Chandra. And if you notice, it is spewing out streams of energy from Sagittarius A, and they are also twisting and spinning in this very weird sort of torsional way. This is an example that they have on the Chandra website of how they view this energy coming out of this black hole. And also, they see it as pumping energy out in a circular motion like this, sort of in a spiral from the plane. So what's going to happen is, as our solar system lines up with the center of the galaxy, if this thing is spewing out energy, which it does every year as we pass this location, the idea is that you have this alignment, and you could theoretically have some sort of issue. You could have an increase in energy to our solar system. Now, people will tell you that, okay, big deal. The alignment was actually a lot more perfect in 1998 than it's going to be in 2012. So why is 2012 more important? Well, this period of alignment started in 1980, and it came to the midpoint in 1998. And in 2012, of course, we're going to be leaving. We're not going to be lined up as perfectly as we were in 1998. But again, what I just showed you is that as you come to this tangent condition at the end of the cycle, that's actually when you get the most intense energy. But people said, look, you lined up in 1998, it was all perfect, and absolutely nothing happened. Well, that's not exactly true. There is a big wobble of the Earth, which is a precessional spin, and there's a smaller wobble called the Chandler wobble. So that's kind of like the Earth is slowly spinning on this axis over 26,000 years, and then there's this little wobble that goes in between that. Well, that abruptly deflected in December of 1998, right about the time we would theoretically have come into this beam of energy. And it took about 20 months to recover, and this actually is a close-up of this, where literally what happened is the Earth jumped on its axis right where that little blue notch is. So again, the Earth did get hit by something, and it shuddered. Now, I went back and I started looking at December ever since then with this Chandler wobble, and what I found is that basically every December, the spin axis jumps and deflects. The Earth jumps, and one of the times that it happened was in December, right before the big Indonesian tsunami that killed, 300,000 people. So, the way it was portrayed in the news is that, there was this huge earthquake and the Earth actually jumped on its spin axis. Well, no, what happened was that the Earth jumped on its spin axis and then there was an earthquake. So to me, there's no question that these things can have an effect, but the question is, okay, again, how big is it going to be? Here's some more examples. There's another example of a deflection in 2006. Is it going to be, catastrophic tidal waves like we had in Indonesia? Is it going to be, is the sun going to get stimulated into a gigantic solar flare? Is it going to be all these different nightmare scenarios of 2012? Or is it going to be something that's going to happen necessarily later? Well, again, Richard did some experiments in 2006, actually from Albuquerque, I believe, with this little tuning fork thing during this December-January period. And what he found was that as you went through into January, the effect actually got more dramatic of this torsion energy being spewed out from the sun. Don't know what that slide's doing there. So as we moved into January, we had a much bigger effect. He took measurements day after day after day, and what he's looking at is, okay, there's this sort of lighthouse effect like you get with a quasar, where there's a beam of energy being pumped out, and it's causing these different effects in the solar system. And as we move through from December 21st into January of 2013, that's when you might have to worry more. So probably nothing at all will happen on December 21st, 2012 of any major significance, but something might begin to happen in January of 2013. So how this is connected is that what they will tell you is that the solar system is this. It is 8 primary planets. There are multiple dwarf planets. There's a lot of rocks in the asteroid belt. And how those rocks formed according to NASA and everybody else, is that, well, it was a planet that didn't clump together. But there's a lot of issues with the accretion model of the solar system. I don't have time to go into the exploded planet hypothesis. I could do this for another 4 or 5 hours, but you'd really be bored. Here's where the solar system really started. It really started out with a bunch of planets, 8 primary planets. Those were Venus, Earth, what I call Tiamat and Phaeton, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune. There are 2 missing planets, those 2 in the middle. One, Tiamat, is about where Mars is now, and Phaeton is where the asteroid belt is. If you look at Bode's law, it says there should be planets there. There really aren't. Mars is not a planet, it's a moon. You can go type in Mars tidal model on Google, and you can read 45 pages, basically, of why Mars is a moon of a planet that blew up and not a planet itself. So there's also a prediction inherent in this that there are 1 or 2 more planets way, way out, maybe 50 billion miles out. So how this fits in is that the reason that the Earth precesses is because the solar system is not what it used to be. These 2 planets are missing, and that has messed up the entire harmonics of the system. So the precession is this higher dimensional tugging on the planet, trying to get it to get in harmony with the rest of the solar system. Now, most of the planets have a spin axis that is basically vertical. It's 90 degrees. Okay, Uranus has one that's way off. It's like pointing completely horizontally. But the Earth is off by about 23.5 degrees. So the principle is that that is a problem, and the reason that that's happening is because everything is messed up from these 2 planets being missing. So that's not really too much of an issue because we've gone through these sorts of alignments before, and as far as we know, 26,000 years ago, nothing really catastrophic happened when we lined up with the center of the galaxy. But there is another factor here, which is that in Dark Mission we talked about the possibility of a Planet X. Now, they've been looking for Planet X forever. Some people think it's Sitchin's Nibiru. Some people have different ideas about what it is. There seems to be something in the outer solar system tugging on comets and asteroids and so forth. But another idea is that there is an object called Nemesis, which the solar system actually orbits around. So either one of these scenarios is possible. Now, what we said in Dark Mission was that you've got 2 possibilities. You've got 1 really massive planet way, way out there, 50 billion miles, or 2 smaller planets in retrograde orbits. So what happens is that in this interconnected system, you've got a certain amount of energy. That energy is the spin energy or the angular momentum of the solar system. And again, as I told you, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune have 99% of the spin energy in the solar system. But the issue is, what if there is another object or 2 other objects that are about that 50 billion miles out, 550 astronomical units out, that have a slow orbital period, half of a precessional cycle, and what if they are moving into the path of this beam of energy that comes from the center of the galaxy around 2012. Well, I don't know if they're out there. I do know NASA's looking for them. In 1982, they found this object with the IRAS, an infrared satellite, that they talked about in the Washington Post. And for Dark Mission, I talked to Gary Neugebauer, who is quoted in this article right here in the Washington Post, about this object, which happens to be 50 billion miles away. It is very cold. It's like a star or a planet, but not really either one. Basically, it's what we now call a brown dwarf. And the interesting thing is that when I talked to him, emailed him, he said, I don't remember that at all. I said, really? You don't remember being on the front page of the Washington Post? What about when you were in the New York Times or Time Magazine or, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution? You don't remember any of those either, Dr. Neugebauer? So he didn't answer me after that. So the fact is, and you can't find anything about it. I recently wrote him again, and he said, I don't know, we never followed up on it. It turned out to be nothing. And there's a whole BS paper out there. I think even, again, Wikipedia has some stuff out there about how, they went and studied it and found out it was just an artifact in the data, right? Okay. So also, one of your heroes, J. Allen Hynek, wrote about these two planets. I think he called them Vulcan and something else in astronomy magazines. And basically, it was readily accepted in the 60s that there probably were two missing planets out there. And it put them in different spaces, one about 4.5 billion miles out, and one considerably farther than that, maybe 50 billion miles out. But that they actually stated in some of these articles that the Voyager and Pioneer satellites were launched into interstellar space so they could measure the gravitational effects of these two planets out there that they were looking for. So, interestingly, in a encyclopedia, there is an example of an article where it actually talks about the planet Vulcan and a, quote, dead star, brown dwarf and a dead star, that are actually out there in these two different locations. And they've been, it's in an encyclopedia from the 1970s. It must be for real, right? So, again, there definitely is something in, remember, these encyclopedias in these days, they went to the science teachers, they went to NASA, they said, write these articles for us. So they put this stuff in here, I don't know, conditioning, trying to get us ready for this idea that these might be out there. So what happens? Well, what happens is that if this planet, whatever it is, let's call it Planet X, let's say there's one of them, and it gets into alignment with this energy that's coming from the center of the galaxy, then it could theoretically amplify whatever the effect of that energy is. Okay? So the question is, what's the effect going to be? We know we've had some earthquakes. We know we've had some issues. And if you include Planet X in that, then theoretically you could have some of the 2012 scenarios. You could have maybe a pole shift. You could have a big solar flare. You could have basically a bad hair day. Well, some people argue, a lot of people argue that the Mayans say that that's not the case. This is the Aztec calendar stone. It's not exactly the Mayan calendar. It's based on the Mayan calendar. It's the same basic time and counting structure. It's interesting. I've seen people like Greg Braden talk about this as the Mayan calendar. Again, it's the Aztec calendar, not the Mayan calendar. I had a great picture of Obama standing in front of this calendar stone. I took it out. I don't know why. But all of our knowledge about this is based on the Dresden Codex. Now, the Dresden Codex is one of the four surviving documents of the early, basically, myths and creation myths of the Mayan people. And it was found by the Spaniards in the 1600s. They promptly burned all of them except 4. This is called the Dresden Codex because it was basically primarily housed in Dresden, Germany, while they were studying it. And it took until the 70s and 80s for this stuff to actually be decoded. And when it was decoded, what they found was that the Dresden Codex was basically a series of almanacs and astronomical charts that had to do with the orbit of the Earth, with precession, with Venus transits, and with eclipses. So they were monitoring all this stuff that should theoretically change our physics and maybe even change our consciousness. That's really interesting for people that were supposedly primitive sun god worshippers that sacrificed people. Now, there are 4 codexes that still exist. There's the Dresden Codex, the Paris Codex. I think one was called the Encino Codex, but that's not real. Anyway, that's Tom David Morton's joke. Anyways, you go through this thing, it tells all these stories, and there are different hieroglyphs. They were eventually decoded. And the very last panel of the Dresden Codex is really interesting because what it talks about, or what it shows, is that when you run to the end of this long count cycle, this 5,125-year cycle, which began in 3114 BC, then what will happen is that Kukulkan, who is it Kukulkan? Quetzalcoatl or Kukulkan, I always get the Aztec versus the Mayan mixed up. This god is going to resurrect this bad guy named Seven Macaw, and they are going to pull a serpent down from the sky, and he is going to pour water down upon the earth from the heavens, and that's the image of what happens in 2012. Now, it's interesting because, you know, the sky, the Milky Way, sorry, I'm going to go back, is generally viewed as a serpent. The symbol of the Ouroboros, I've got a tattoo on my arm, is considered to be the center of the Milky Way galaxy. It's a snake consuming its own tail. So the very center is considered a serpent. So essentially you could say that something about 2012 having to do with the serpent, the center of the galaxy, is going to cause this water to pour down on us. Now, whether that's a flood or rain, water also symbolically in astrology typically means knowledge. In other words, knowledge of higher spirit is coming down into your brain. So it could be that also. Well, some people have figured this stuff out, and they talk about the Mayan calendar in terms of it being a spiritual calendar. John Major Jenkins is very big on it, not being any kind of catastrophe, that it's all going to be basically just about spirit. Well, if you look at the Mayan monumental architecture, and one of the things in Dark Mission, of course, is we're looking at monumental architecture, we think, on Mars. And the Mayans were very interesting because they built these step pyramids that all had 9 levels. There were 9 steps to each one of these pyramids. And what Carl Kalaman, who is one of the best calendar researchers as far as I'm concerned, has decided is that what these represent is 9 different levels of what are called the underworlds. The Mayans believed that the universe consisted of 9 underworlds and 13 heavens, and they were all held together by the tree of life, which was like the axial support. In other words, like the spin axis of the earth, which supported the heavens and the earth. So when they say underworlds, they don't mean them in the traditional way that the Catholics might mean them, or traditional Western religions. They were the underpinnings, the support structures of our physical reality. Now, what Kalaman interprets is that these different levels took place, started with way back at the origin of the universe, which was 16.4 billion years ago, quite a bit older than modern science says that it is, which I think is 13.7 billion years, and that each one of these progressive steps gets shorter and shorter, and yet they continue on. In other words, the very first level of consciousness, which has been going on for 16.4 billion years, is still going on. It's supporting the rest of us. But the very last phases will only take place over 12.8 years, and the very last one will be 260 days, which is 1 Mayan sacred calendar year. Now, according to Kalaman, again, each of these represents a different level of consciousness. He viewed it as the cellular underworld, the mammalian underworld, the familiar. In other words, as we evolve our consciousness, we go from being cells to mammals to families to having tribes to having regions, nations, planets, planetary underworld, and the planetary underworld would be the period of like the 1960s where we started to view the planet. We started to worry about ourselves in terms of being planetary citizens. Now we're in the phase it's called the galactic underworld. In other words, we're now going to start viewing ourselves as citizens of the galaxy, and at the end of this, at the end of the calendar, whether it's 2012 or 2011, and Kalaman disagrees about that, we're going to have this thing where we're going to wake up and suddenly realize we're part of this big, beautiful, perfect universe. And again, some of the dates that he sets for these things to happen, bottom line is we are in these, supposed to be in these last 2 phases right now as far as his interpretation of the calendar goes. The current galactic underworld started on 5/1/1999. It's going to last 12.5 years, roughly, so it's going to end, according to Kalaman, in 2011. And along the way, how he viewed each of these underworlds was that they were broken up again into 13 pieces. So there's, again, the 9 and the 13. Each of the 9 levels has 13 pieces, and these pieces are like, again, a waveform, up and down. He calls them days and nights. So you've basically got 6 nights and 7 days that make up each one of these underworlds, and each one of these days is shorter for each underworld as they get shorter. So right now, theoretically, we would be in the 6th night of the galactic underworld of the Mayan calendar, and when we come out of that, we're going to be in the 7th day where things are supposed to get better, and then we're going to achieve this end of this up and down wave movement where we're going to be in, spiritual perfection. We're going to be reunited with God. Now, how I got interested in all this stuff moving from dark mission to this stuff, was that we supposedly went into the sixth night on November 7th, 2009. And I didn't know any of this stuff then. That was last November. But I had a really incredibly profound spiritual experience with someone within about 30 minutes of moving over into the sixth night. And it's like my whole perspective changed. And that's exactly what, if you read his stuff, is supposed to happen to people. And since I've had that experience, I've had people, you know, that you would never think, very shallow, superficial people that do not think about, they watch American Idol, you know, they watch Melrose Place, they don't come to MUFON meetings, they aren't interested in anything beyond themselves, are starting to ask me about 2012 and aliens and extraterrestrials. And I don't know if it's happening to you, but the calendar says that if this physics is real and our consciousness is affected by the planets, that people are going to start waking up and they're going to start becoming more aware. And that's why we're going to get more and more aliens and things showing up, because more people are going to be awakened to this stuff. So how this works is that things get quiet at night, things kind of go dark, they're not so great, but then more action takes place during the day. So even though we're in the sixth night now, which ends November 2nd, 2010, things should start to get, even though we're on an upswing, things will get very chaotic. And what this predicts, by the way, he also predicted the exact date of the beginning of the economic downturn when the housing bubble burst, which was November 18th, 2007. He predicted it in 2001 using the system. So he's got a few, you know, accurate predictions. I don't know if any of you guys watch WebBot, the CliffBot stuff. Read that stuff. I don't. Ever since half of Africa failed to slide off into the Atlantic Ocean, I've kind of given up on them. But a lot of people like their stuff. But I found Kalaman's actually more accurate than them, at least in my opinion. So as part of this process, other people that interpreted this stuff way back, the good thing about this is that what Kalaman says, and what everybody that has this spiritual interpretation of the Mayan calendar says, is that we can affect this change. Now, in 1987, there was something called the harmonic convergence. I don't know if you remember it. If you're over 50, you might remember hearing about it. You know, TV and radio were not quite what they are now. There wasn't as much media. But I remember people making fun of it, and basically a bunch of hippies got together and prayed for peace and all the hippie stuff that I'm like Cartman from South Park. You know, I hate hippies, but now I'm one of them, unfortunately. Can't say God doesn't have a sense of humor, right? So this happened, and everybody poo-pooed it. But what happened right after that? What happened right after 87 was that the U.S. and Russia agreed to reduce nuclear arms. The Soviet Union then collapsed. A period of peace ensued. We did have the first Gulf War, but we had the fewest casualties of pretty much any war in the 20th century, any major conflict between nations in the 20th century. I mean, the Americans, we lost 372 guys in 30 days of combat. Okay? By contrast, in World War II, we lost 12,000 guys in the Battle of the Bulge on the very first day. Okay, so even the wars seem to be minor. There were no other open conflicts between nations. The economy started to take off. Well, I guess after Al Gore invented the internet, it started to take off. But the economy was very good. A lot of wealth was generated. It was a nice time, but according to the calendar that Kalaman laid out in 1999, where's that slide? Let me go back. In 1999, when we were supposed to start this next phase, the galactic phase, that things would transition. And, well, things started to get a little bit crappy in 1999. You know, the stock market bubble burst. We had the recession of 2000. And then we had, of course, 9/11. So things did get kind of worse. Now, one of the things they tracked very specifically was these passages of Venus, the Venus transits of 2004, and there's going to be another one in 2012. You guessed it. But he also says that there's a second harmonic convergence. Now, the idea behind this is that people would put out their spiritual energy for peace, for harmony, for, not having earthquakes and floods and fires and solar flares. Basically, you set your intent for the kind of world you want to live in. And it sounds like baloney, except the reality is that each one of us here actually is generating about 100 watts of energy at any given moment, of electrical energy. Now, that's not that much. You have a 100-watt light bulb, but if you take the atoms inside of a 100-watt light bulb and you split every one of them, you've got more total destructive force in there than all the nuclear arsenals of the world has ever seen. That's one. And each of you is recreating that 100 watts every moment that you exist. You're recreating it over and over again. So how much power do 7 billion people on this planet have? The point being that, according to Kalaman, there would be a second harmonic convergence which would come up before we hit these events of 2012, and it would be an opportunity for us to decide whether or not we wanted to have a good world or a bad world. The date that he originally set for that was this upcoming May 27th. He's now revised it. He always had a date of July 17th of this year as a big deal. He called it the cosmic convergence. He now says that's the real harmonic convergence. This other thing is sort of the beginning of the pre-wave of it. But what I'm trying to do is actually organize events where people will get together, and I don't care if you're Christian, Mormon, Jew, if you're a member of the Aetherius Society and you want to worship Aetherius, I don't care what you do, but I believe it's going to be very important for us to all give it some thought and set our intent and decide what kind of a planet we want to have in the next few years, because things are going to change. Now, as we go through these, it's important to understand that it wasn't just the Mayans that thought that this period of time was important. The Egyptians tracked time through the Giza Meridian from the Giza Plateau, and how they track it is the rising and falling of Orion on the meridian at midnight on the winter solstice. And if you go to that, what you find is that Orion's belt will rise and fall in half a precessional cycle, about 13,000 years, up and down and up and down. Now, it will end in 2175, which is a few years in the future, but we're kind of in the ballpark. We're within about, 3 or 4% of that 26,000-year cycle, because nobody really knows when the precessional cycle begins and ends. The same thing with the Yuga cycles, and I've recently been doing some research for the book on the Yuga cycles, and what I found is that the Vedas say that the Earth, and the Earth, in fact, revolves around the Sun. The Sun itself revolves around something that they call the Vishnu Navi, which I think is literally Vishnu's navel. And there is some argument about what that is. There's a very well-respected scholar from the 1800s who says, the Vishnu Navi is actually a dead star or a dead planet that we can't see, that we orbit around on a 24,000 or 25,000 year cycle, again, matching precession pretty well. But there's also, I think, an argument to be made that it's actually, they're talking about the galactic center. So, and again, we have this elliptical path around the galactic center. It's a 260 million year orbit. I think this number, 25,920, connects all this stuff. That's the number of precession. If you take that number and divide it up into the 12 houses of the zodiac, the precession of the equinoxes, it's 2160, 2,160 years. The diameter of the moon is exactly 2,160 miles. If you go look and calculate the Yuga cycles, I just did this the other day, it's going to be in the book. If you take 6 cycles using the millions of years that they say that each of these cycles lasts, it comes out to exactly 25,920,000 years. So these numbers keep showing up again and again and again. The sun, in fact, is 26,000 light years from the center of the galaxy. How much you want to bet when we get a better, more accurate reading, it's going to actually be 25,920,000 light years from the center of the galaxy. It's a 250 to 260 million year orbit around the center of the galaxy. How much you want to bet it's going to turn out to be 259,200,000 years. In other words, it's just like a decimal harmonic. We have these small cycles and these big cycles, exactly like the Mayan calendar has these small calendar calculators and these big things, and they're sort of like all interconnected. So the question is, what does all this mean? Well, and is this thing going to be, there's going to be a physical change? Is there going to be an emotional or a consciousness change? One thing too, I don't think I have a great slide for this, but if you go to the Mayan prophecies, what John Major Jenkins actually says is that Quetzalcoatl, what will happen in 2012 is that Quetzalcoatl will ride what the Mayans called a serpent rope from the center of the galaxy, and when he arrives here, he will judge our planet. Okay, now it's interesting that a serpent rope would be what do serpents do? They coil, they spin, they twist. It's a torsion effect. So I think what they're saying is there's going to be this torsion effect, some sort of beam coming from the center of the galaxy. Well, what could that mean? Well, again, as I dug into this stuff, what I found was that there's actually been some studies on ESP. extrasensory perception, or what they call anomalous cognition in the academic studies. And a couple years ago, some guys decided, well, is there a pattern to this, right? Is there any kind of pattern to this that we can find? And what they found was that, yeah, there was a pattern. Right about midnight or 12 noon, local sidereal time, people's intuition, people's cognition, people's ESP seem to spike using all the tests that they've been using for 40 or 50 years to measure this stuff. And then it would actually get more intense until about 13:30 or 1:30 in the afternoon, local sidereal time, and then it would drop off dramatically. So in other words, for about an hour and a half after you're exactly aligned with whatever local sidereal time midnight is. Well, what is it? It's the galactic center. That's when Sagittarius and Sagittarius A is most directly overhead at your location. You can go to the web, you can look for a local sidereal time calculator here in LA. It's about, I don't know if they've corrected it for daylight time or not, but it's about 10:15 if they have. It's probably 9:15 or 11:15 if they haven't. But you've got a window in there where theoretically your ESP should be more enhanced. So if you want to communicate with your friends with the big eyes, you know, with Lee Strieber's friends. If you want to communicate with this, if you want to maybe try to talk to somebody through the ether, this is the best time to try it. But they found that there is a pattern and it's connected to the center of the galaxy, and that's exactly what the Hindu Vedas said was going to happen when we got lined up with the center of the galaxy near the end of the Yuga cycles. And it's this which is going to push us into this golden age. So another thing that's all related to these same numbers is that over the 250 million year orbit of the Earth around, or 260, the Earth around the galactic center, is that there are extinction cycles which have been mapped. And guess what? They're 26 million years. How much you want to bet that ultimately they're going to be more accurately dated to 25,920,000 years? So that's the dinosaur right there. That's the extinction of the dinosaur. So again, it's a pattern of this 26, 26, 26. I don't know what it means. I believe it has something to do with the fact that that's, you know, everything in the universe, I think, is numbers and geometry. And again, if you read Dark Mission, we go on and on about geometry and numbers and alignments and all that stuff. And for some reason, this number, 26 or 25,920, has something to do with creating our physical reality here. So what do the Hindus say about the cycles, the Yuga cycles? Well, right now, according to, well, again, it's debatable, but right now, the Iron Age, the bad time, is what's called the Kali Yuga. Okay, there's the Satya Yuga, which is the golden age, and there's the Kali Yuga, which is the bad age. So I started digging into who the hell Kali is. All right, well, this is Kali. Not a real pleasant character. He is standing on the body of Shiva. Shiva is a god that is the preserver. In other words, they divide up. You know, there's a whole thing that the word God actually stands for generator, operator, destroyer, right? And in the Hindu, they have the same belief, but they call them somebody, and Shiva is the preserver, and this other god, or no, Shiva's a destroyer. So what happens is that Kali comes at the end of the Yuga cycle, and he chops off people's heads and uses their arms for a belt, and basically she is a basically very unpleasant person that comes along at the end of the Kali Yuga and basically cleanses the earth of all of the bad people, which is everybody who's materialistic and not spiritual, and only a few of the good people survive, which does not sound like a lot of fun to me because I don't think I'm a very good person, actually. So, how many of us are? So, as I, got into this a little bit more and started to really look at it, the question is, are we in this Kali Yuga cycle? Well, I think we are, because as I read the documents, it said stuff along the lines of, what will you see, how will you know you're in the bad cycle, the Kali Yuga cycle? Well, you'll see that people are interested only in the material, they're not interested in the spiritual, they will pursue money, their monetary systems will collapse because they're based on greed. Sex will become the overwhelmingly most important aspect of life, to the point that young girls, 13 to 16 years old, will be getting pregnant. Gee, is that happening? Men and women will be intoxicated with drink and drugs. Gee, is that happening? Basically, it's the whole 20th century. There will be wars for no reason. Rulers will, impose unfair taxes. And things will be basically, I'm looking at it going, yeah, that's pretty much the time period right now. But the nice thing about it is that as you get into all of these things, each one of them does say that there's an opportunity for us to turn away from this unspiritual direction, this materialistic direction, and towards the good, and it can all be abated. So the question is, how do we do that, and what is the choice that we have to make? Well, as the next few years pass, a lot of interesting things are going to happen astronomically. Now, again, I'm going to make the case very extensively in the book that all this astronomical alignments, all these things actually do matter, and they will affect what happens here on the Earth. So as I looked at what was going to happen over the next couple years astronomically around us, I came to the conclusion that there's no way that nothing can happen. Now, I don't know what's going to happen because I don't know quite yet what we're going to pick, but I guarantee you something interesting is going to happen in the next few years. And this may be just the beginning of a transitional period. 2016 may actually be the most important year as opposed to 2012, but we're definitely entering a phase where things are going to get interesting and quirky. What's driving it are some really weird coincidences in astronomy. For instance, I don't think I've got a chart here, but this year there is an eclipse on the winter solstice, which doesn't happen very often because there aren't that many eclipses that actually happen on a specific day, and it's going to happen exactly 2 years before the winter solstice of 2012. In 2012, there's going to be an annular solar eclipse in May. Now, okay, there's annual solar eclipses on a fairly regular basis over various cycles. What's interesting about this is that one of the last things that Kalaman said about this period, the galactic underworld, when it ends and we go into the universal underworld, is what will happen is, or rather when the sixth night ends and the seventh day begins, what will happen is that the east and the west will become balanced. The left brain and the right brain, the intellect and the heart will become balanced. The masculine and the feminine will become balanced. So that's what he says is going to happen during this transitional period of 2010 to 2012. Well, in May of 2012, there's this annular solar eclipse, and it's going to, come on, keep going, there we go. And it's going to happen on a new moon on May 20th of 2012. And as you look at this, the eclipse, that red dot there is the actual point of greatest eclipse. It's the dead center of the eclipse. And if you notice, it starts in the east on the Tropic of Cancer, which is 45 degrees halfway between the equator and the pole. Again, balance, equator, pole, right in the middle. It goes across the Pacific Ocean, and its actual moment of complete, total, full eclipse is right over the international date line, which is the boundary between east and west. And then it crosses the Pacific, and it ends on the west coast of the United States. And it ends on the west coast of the United States right over, there's the three positions, right over a very specific place, which is Mount Shasta, California. Now, I got some bums and some booms back there because Mount Shasta has it's a very big, important spiritual center for all the Indian tribes of this part of the world. There's rumored to be a UFO base there. People see weird stuff there. During the Harmonic convergence in '87, people had some really weird experiences there. So it seems to be really important for some reason. I think that the Etherians, the Etherian Society, say that they've been told that Shasta has some special significance too. So again, this eclipse is going to basically, if these kinds of events affect consciousness, it's going to affect us exactly the way Kalaman, through a completely different set of data, which is the Mayan calendar, says our consciousness is going to be affected. So I expect something pretty interesting to happen during this eclipse or right after it. Now, the other thing I want to point out is that what's important here are the so-called tangent points. Remember how in the Venus transit, as Venus left the sun, as it passed beyond the disk of the sun, that's when the tuning fork went nuts and started vibrating the most. Oh, by the way, 6 days after the Venus, after this, 6 days after the eclipse is the Venus transit, okay, where the second Venus transit takes place over the 8-year period. And then in November, right before December, we have another eclipse happening. So keeping in mind that these end conditions are actually more intense than the perfect alignments, it makes sense that the most intense effect we're going to get from whatever's coming from the center of the galaxy is going to be probably more likely in the winter of 2016 and 2017 than it is in 2012. So I'm not going to necessarily latch onto the 2012 date as something specific happening. In the physics, it's more likely we're going to have this, the galactic equator and the sun's position is going to create the most intense effect in 2016. Now, other people will tell you, like in astrology, that the conditions are exactly the same as they were for the American Revolution in 1775 over this next summer. So there's a lot of stuff that could be affecting all this. You look at crop circles, and there's a lot of them that are tetrahedral, that are, again, pointing to trines, pointing to, this is a very hyperdimensional tetrahedral crop circle. There's some, and again, I don't know how to interpret these, but I'm told that these completely link up with the Mayan calendar and are representations of that. There have been some other circles recently that are kind of interesting. Here's one that represents pretty clearly the solar system. You've got the sun, you've got Mercury, you've got Venus, you've got Mars, you've got the asteroid belt, but look at the third orbit there. Okay, that would be where the Earth is, and it's not there. And this alignment of planets is exactly the way it's going to look in December of 2012, except hopefully the Earth will actually be there. Okay, so again, this is a crop circle that says something about 2012, and the Earth isn't there. Well, what does that mean? What's the meaning of it? Here's another one with the same kind of example, with the Earth not there. So another thing that's kind of loosely connected to this, which I'm not going to talk about too much, I got this from a buddy of mine. This is supposedly something that as Nostradamus was nearing the end of his life, he told his son certain things, and he made sketches. And his son apparently finished them as paintings. And this is the last thing that he ever painted. And there's people, again, that connect this with the calendar and with 2012. And it's supposed to be a self-portrait of him. And what he's representing here with this book is what is going to happen at the end times, this period in history, which he did identify as shortly after the year 2000. And the thing that Nostradamus is doing in this painting is he's holding out a book, right? It's the book of our history or our future, and it's blank. It's blank. There's no Earth there, it's blank. What does this mean? Well, Kalaman talks about these harmonic convergences, the cosmic convergence of May 27th, and it's a chance for us to affect things. So what we're talking about is the possibility that we can, on these very specific dates where we have these specific astronomical alignments, set the tone of what's going to happen. Now, what I think is that this is all about, and again, there's so much more detail that I couldn't get into tonight, but what I think this is all about is that this pulse of energy is going to come from the center of the galaxy. It does wash over us. It does affect us. Every December when we line up, we're getting hit by this thing. And all of these ancient texts talk about this alignment with something important happening in the center of the galaxy. And this torsion wave of energy is going to hit us. Kukulkan is going to ride the torsion wave, the serpent rope, and he's going to appear here, he's going to manifest here in our reality, and he's going to judge us. Now, the traditional way of looking at this is the Christian way, judgment, the day of judgment, Terminator 2 Judgment Day. You're good, you're bad, you go to heaven, you go to hell. I don't think that's what it is. I think it's a misinterpretation. What I think the judgment is what do we want? What's our intent? What is the intent of this planet? That's what I think the aliens are watching. Because they're higher spiritual entities. Most of them, I think, are living on a higher plane than us. They want to know what we're going to choose. That's why everybody's here. That's why all these ghosts are here. That's why the aliens, the ETs are here. Because they want to see what we're going to decide. What's our intent going to be? And to me, it comes down to just two questions. Who are you and what do you want? Really? Are you going to be locked into fear and conflict and selfishness and materialism? Or are you going to be in spirit and giving and selflessness and peace and resolving issues with your brother? That's what I think the intent is that they're going to be looking for, that this energy is going to be looking for. The good thing is that according to most of these texts, it only takes a few people, about 144,000, to decide for everyone. So can we have bad scenarios? Can we have pole shifts? Can we have a great cleansing like the Hopi talk about? I didn't even get into the Hopi stuff. Will these things happen? Possibly, but we also could have everything be perfect. We could have that golden age that the Yuga cycles talk about. So, a couple things. I've been a big conspiracy theorist. I've been into all this stuff, this dark mission stuff, and I still think that all that stuff is real. There are people that are preparing for this event. As you look around at governments and you look around at all the stuff we're seeing, the concentration camps, all the stuff, some of the things I heard about, yeah, governments are very nervous. They know that there's change coming, they don't know what, and they're sort of getting ready for that. But the bottom line is that it's up to us to decide, not up to them, because what the physics also says and what the calendar also says is that whatever they decide to do to try to contain this wave of change is not going to work. It's not going to work. We're all going to decide for ourselves what we're going to do.
Hey, Mike, I think we'll call it an evening, and thanks so much for coming. It was a great talk.
Thank you.